Good morning. We'll start the Planning Committee meeting. On the committee with me is Terry Borneman and Dan Hamill. And we have two items this morning to talk about. The first one is an ordinance creating an incentive program for innovative, affordable, low-income home ownership projects in single-family and multifamily residential zoning districts. We had a public hearing not 2 weeks ago. I think it was more than that. 2 meetings ago, 2 council meetings ago, a month ago. And this is our attempt at a work session to try and resolve some of the issues that came up, which were actually quite a few issues. So what I'll do is I'll turn it over to David Stallheim, from the Planning Community Development Department, and we'll just have a discussion about what some of these issues are and how we'll resolve them. So, David?
All right, thank you. Good morning. David Stallheim, Planning and Community Development Department, and I'm going to walk you just through the memo that's dated, we revised it on March 11th. It's in your packet, attachment 1 to your packet. Walk through those issues, and then perhaps after we walk through those issues, we can then go back and have some specific discussion or direction from the council on any of those issues. So the first issue that we had is historic resource protection. On January 10th, the York Neighborhood Association submitted a letter to the council and to the department regarding protection for historic resources, and their concern was that we wouldn't be seeing the demolition of structures in order to then receive the density bonus that would be available under this program. A couple of years ago, we had provisions put into the multifamily tax exemption program, and they requested for those same provisions to be put into here. Staff does support that. I was just talking with Mr. Eskeridge, and he had some concerns about that and some clarification with respect to the issue about vacancy, because there is a number 2 on page 2 of your memo, talks about application for new construction on a vacant property, which previously stood a structure that was listed in the register would not be eligible unless a minimum of 5 years has passed. And so that was something we put in the multifamily tax exemption, that someone wouldn't tear it down, claim that it was vacant and no longer eligible. So we wanted to see some time had passed, that basically the density bonus wasn't the incentive to tear the building down. So vacant property that's been more than 5 years would still be eligible under this program. So that's the first one. Staff does recommend putting these provisions into the ordinance. The second issue has to do with density, with distance to transit. We added a walkability requirement to this, the 1/4 mile walking distance of a Whatcom transit route. We had input during the process before the Planning Commission and before the council that some had supported the 1/4 mile walkability standard, and others had suggested going all the way up to a 1/2 mile. Before we adopted our recommendation for this and sent it to the Planning Commission, we did consult with Whatcom Transit staff on this, and they supported the idea of a 1/4 mile standard within the city of Bellingham. After the hearing, and once again consulted with them, and they sent another email with specific data and a chart that's in your memo. It shows that less than 5% of riders will go more than a 1/2 mile to a Whatcom transit or to any transit route. And so we continue to think that that's the appropriate standard, not only for access to transit, but when you think about the density bonuses that we're doing and the idea of having an increased density so far from a transit route, we think would be a little bit not headed in the direction that we should be for some of the livability, walkability issues in the community. The other thing is that in the housing levy, we do have for new construction, we do have a requirement that all of our incentives for those programs to provide funding has to be within a 1/4 mile. So if we are having projects under this ordinance that would go up to a 1/2 mile, it would be inconsistent with our provisions under the levy that require a 1/4 mile standard. The next item of top discussion was the decision-making process. We received input about the process for decision-making. The current process is that the record is developed in front of the hearing examiner and the final decision is made by the council. In a closed record process before the council, we presented the Planning Commission with two options as part of their decision-making, with both of the process being the final decision in front of the hearing examiner. The only distinction between the process was who would hear the appeal, whether the appeal would go to Superior Court or to City Council. This is a quasi-judicial land use matter, and the Planning Commission recommended that the final decision go to be appealable to Superior Court, with hearing examiner being the final decision. One of the things that we did hear input on was that members of the public wanted to have access to counsel for these types of projects. Remember that you actually would not be able to get that input under a quasi-judicial process. The record is built in front of the hearing examiner, and so you would have a closed record decision no matter what, even if you took final decision-making authority or the appeal, is that the record is entirely built in front of the hearing examiner, and so you would not be allowed to have that interaction with the public. The fourth issue was an issue of income.
Excuse me, David.
Yeah.
Terry's got a
That's
question.
only if we decide to give it to the hearing examiner. That's not a done deal. Is that correct? Because right now it comes before us. We have to make that decision for it to go to the hearing examiner.
No, it would be the same thing because it's a closed record decision. The open record is in front of the hearing examiner. So
Under the current statutes, doesn't it comes to the council for decision on this particular ordinance is my understanding. When Mathau Place like that came, it was before us. This one's taking it from us to the hearing examiner. Is that correct?
Well,
Am I wrong on that?
Under Alan Mariner, Deputy City Attorney, under the ordinance, the previous ordinance that is now expired, it was a public hearing before the hearing examiner, with the hearing examiner, I believe, making a recommendation to council, which council considered and made the final decision.
Yeah.
But as David said, it is a quasi-judicial matter, so the record is the record that was formed at the public hearing before the hearing examiner. So you couldn't have another public hearing and create an additional items for the record before council.
Okay. I just
Yeah,
wanted to make sure.
that's what I remembered with the Lafayette, Indiana Street project.
Yeah, okay.
More recent, that
Okay,
we ended up doing it that way.
I knew we had, but the decision was with us, not with the, she made recommendations. Yeah, okay.
yeah, that was the distinction I was trying to make, was that you're
Okay.
not allowed to take more input after the hearing examiner, not that it was, the decision would change type of
Right.
thing, so.
Okay.
The fourth item has to do with income mix. The current ordinance requires 100% of the units be affordable. In our initial recommendation to the Planning Commission, we recommended that 75% of the units be affordable to low-income households. Range of input was received during the process, going from maintaining the 100% of units being affordable to going down to 51% of the units being affordable. In your memo, I give you a table that shows that under any of those scenarios, one of the balancing acts that I looked at is that the density bonus is always less than the number of affordable units. And so you are getting more, so even if you go down to 51%, you're getting more affordable units than the density that you're granting. And that's one of the distinctions that I was kind of looking at in these tables. And so any of those scenarios I think are doable. One of the things that we are trying to achieve with the mix of incomes, actually two things we're trying to do, is first off, I think it creates a healthier project to have a mix of incomes within a project rather than all affordable units. The second is that it has the potential to attract private development to help sponsor projects to these things. The more that you have a mixed rate project, the more chance that you would have to have private development participate in this. In the second category has to do with permanent affordability. The proposed ordinance takes that out and replaces it with 50 years of affordability, which is what the requirement is under the Growth Management Act for incentive ordinances for affordable low-income housing. We did have some input that concerned that we're retreating from the benefits of permanent affordability, which is not the case at all with our recommendation. But we've only had 2 projects in 11 years under the current model. What we're trying to do is trying to find a way of creating some more units being built, and 50 years of affordability has the potential to attract other projects into the community for 50 years of affordability. The question is the density bonus has matched that 50 years of affordability in the final decision making. The 6th category is limits on location. We did receive input, concern about having this located in some sensitive other watersheds, like Lake Patton and Chuckanut Creek watershed, and also within areas that contain critical areas. As we look at this, we're not allowing any regulatory modification of any of our shorelines or critical areas protections or anything in the watersheds. And so we think that those provisions in large measure provide the protections necessary for you. The last category was utilization in urban villages. We had drafted this as being applicable in single-family, multifamily zones, which is what the original ordinance was before we had put urban villages into the zoning code of Bellingham. And so that was a question that Mr. Weiss had brought up during the after the council hearing. And so adding the residential transition zones in urban villages would probably be an appropriate thing for you to do. So that's an overview of the issues that we had heard that continued from the Planning Commission, and some a little bit more elaboration from the City Council hearing. And glad to either answer questions, or if you want to go back and handle each one of those subjects and perhaps provide direction, we'd appreciate that.
Any general clarification questions for David? I had one, and that had to do with the distance to transit. In the, I guess in the suggested language, or the language that we currently have, the draft language, it talks about 1/4 mile walking distance from a WTA route or urban village. Does that mean any urban village we have, including, say, like Barclay? And the reason I say that is that Barclay, the footprint of Barclay is gigantic right now, and if we had 1/4 mile from Barclay, we'd be talking about kind of the top of Alabama Hill would still qualify under this as something that's walkable, but in actuality, it would be a very long distance to get to the 331 GO line.
Good morning, Kurt Nabafeld, Planning and Community Development Department. I think that's a good question. One of the things that Barclay doesn't have at this point in time that is our other urban villages do is define boundaries. You make a good point. We do have areas within, sub-areas within the neighborhood plan that we could utilize to establish those areas. Barclay is a large area. It does and is growing and operating a lot like our other urban villages, but at this point it does not have defined boundaries, but we could come up with some defined boundaries based on the sub-area numbers and of the area. So it's something that's doable. The difference now at this point is it doesn't have defined boundaries as the other urban villages do.
Michael?
I think it does have defined boundaries in the sense that the TIF, the traffic impact fee reductions, do observe those boundaries, even though they weren't defined that way for that purpose originally.
We could line those up.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. David, I was wondering whether or not if I put forward my proposal just for discussion purposes as well, and then we go back through, after that's done, then we go back through and talk about each individual concept or issue, and then be able to come up with the best blend for this. Do you have a problem with that?
It's your meeting.
I know. Well, I'm respecting my staff here.
I think it sounds good.
Okay.
Good idea.
All right, so on the last page of the packet, I presented a table as an insert into the agenda, but since then, I have put together actually, could you pass this to Marie? I put together some draft language that could represent track changes, and it differs a little bit from this table. The concept that I wanted to present was that yes, what David was talking about, the fact that we've only had 2 projects under this demonstration project, there could be different reasons for that, and one of them might be the fact that there is just a very serious entry barrier to getting a project built because of the requirements of this demonstration project. And if we ended up easing some of those barriers and lowering them to a point where we could get more projects, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to abandon the whole concept of permanent affordability. So what I wanted to suggest and put out there is that we have 2 different tracks. One had to do with permanent affordability, and another one had to do with the 50-year affordability. And under these different tracks, we would have different types of incentives, pretty much the same all the way up and down the line, but there'd be a few key items that would be different that would incentivize, I think, the permanent affordability just a little bit more than the 50-year affordability. And this, I think, might help be a compromise to what we have had and where we want to go. So what I was suggesting is that I think what I'll do is just go under the track changes. And under A, it's just basically recognizing the fact that there would be a permanent affordability tract and a 50-year affordability tract. Under B, and this might be maybe the most contentious change here, is that under the 50 affordability tract, that we would do the 51% as been suggested in our public comment. But under the 40-year, or the permanent affordability tract, I was suggesting that we would create a 40% level of affordability as a mechanism to provide, I think, as a whole, more affordable units in the long term. And the way that would work is that if the entry into these types of projects using the bonus density was lower, that we'd have many more units built, both market and affordable housing, to a point where if we ended up lowering that to 40%, that we'd actually have more affordable units than we would if it was 51 or 75% or 100%, because there would be more projects built. And because more projects would be built, we would have a better infill mix into the whole thing. So I'm throwing that out as a suggestion that we would have one particular option where you could actually get down to 40% affordability and 60% market-based housing. The next issue had to do with just the affordability, the market-based ownership itself. Under the 50-year affordability tract, let's go back. Under the permanent affordability tract, that we would have no limitations on income associated with the market-based home ownership. But under the 50-year affordability tract, what I am suggesting now is that we address the workplace housing in the community that fall between 81 and 120% of median income. That would represent a lot of our working professionals that are having a hard time trying to find home ownership that would be, I think, benefiting out of a program like this under the 50-year, and that private developers could then better address that for those people. There's another issue about the guarantee of affordability that that we would have permanent affordability in one aspect and then the 50-year affordability and then the other, similar to the language that was already proposed. And then as far as project location, there's a few different items there. One had to do with recognizing what David was talking about earlier, that we would have the residential transition zones. If we actually called them residential transition zones, then the issues about Barclay would not apply, since technically they don't have residential transition zones yet. If we want to include Barclay, I guess we'd have a different mechanism to do so. But then I also included the Lake Padden watershed as in response to some comments that we received from the public. This is not the Padden Creek watershed, which is different than the Lake Padden watershed. The Padden Creek watershed takes up most of the south side, along with Chuckanut Creek, which was also suggested. But the Lake Padden watershed is a situation where we're trying, I think we need to, as a council and as a city, to start looking at mechanisms to try and protect Lake Padden as we do Lake Whatcom, for very much the same reasons. I think Dan McShane from the County Council has been a strong advocate of this when he was serving on the County Council, and has just a litany of reasons why Lake Padden really should be protected. And we've talked about this in the past, but to me, I think that if we put that in there, it would affect primarily the Samish neighborhood. I don't think it would affect much of anybody else, but in trying to protect the Padden watershed, that would be something I would want to propose. And then as far as the transit distance issue, I had two different tracks. The permanent affordability track would be within 1/2 mile of a transit route that was operating at a frequency of 20 minutes or less. Understanding that WTA is going to be doing a strategic plan, we don't know whether or not it's going to be 15-minute go lines. It could be 20-minute go lines. It could be something else. But I put that in there just as a discussion point. I think 30 minutes might even be appropriate, but right now, just as far as language in here, I thought 20 minutes. And the reason is that we shouldn't be building projects that are on transit routes that are that have very lengthy delays between buses. I think that it serves as much of a distraction as having a bus that's not available at all for distance-wise. I think frequency is the other issue too. And then the other thing was within the 50-year affordability that we would bump it up from 1/4 mile to 1/3 mile to, again, try and incentivize this entire project. And then finally, just as a small technical thing, as far as design review, is to make sure that it says that the projects, which would include affordable and market-based, market rate units, would be developed for design standards to protect neighborhood character. So this is something that I did not address the approval process in these track changes, but I wanted to throw this out as an alternative proposal to see whether or not people thought that we would want to try and preserve the permanent affordability while at the same time trying to address some of the barriers associated with private development and provide for a 50-year affordability tract as well. So I put that out as a proposal and was wondering if there's any questions or comments about it. Dan?
As chair of the Lake Whatcom Reservoir and Natural Resources Committee, I understand the protections for the Lake Whatcom watershed, but what I don't understand is why the Lake Whatcom watershed language would be written into this proposal.
Because we don't want to, I think as a council, we've talked about the fact that we don't want to densify development within the Lake Whatcom watershed any more than what it currently is.
You mean Lake Padden watershed?
No, both, well, Lake Whatcom and Lake Padden. The proposal is to have both Lake Padden and Lake Whatcom be exempt.
I understand that, but the Lake Whatcom is the drinking water source for 100,000 residents, Bellingham and Whatcom County, and Sun Valley as well. And I understand protecting the lake from phosphorus-loading hydrocarbons, metals is critical, but Lake Padden is not a drinking water source. So I'm trying to understand what the reasoning behind that is.
Well, it is a recreational source in a big way, and it also provides water for fish habitat, of which we're spending millions of dollars to try and improve further down in the creek as it heads out to the bay. We do have algae problems in Lake Padden in the summertime, similar to the algae problems that we have in Lake Whatcom. And it would seem that from reports that we've received from a citizen group in the past, a lot of that is coming from, from runoff because of development. And it's the same story in Lake Padden as it is in Lake Whatcom. The only difference is that Lake Whatcom has a much larger volume of water to be able to dilute some of that phosphorus compared to the very shallow depths of Lake Padden. So Lake Padden, I think, translates that algae or the phosphorus into algae a lot quicker and more severe than it would be if it was in Lake Whatcom.
Okay.
Even given the drinking water issue. And that becomes an issue for algae problems in the lake that swimmers have to deal with swimmer's itch and other things when warmer weather shows up.
Okay. No, I understand, what you're saying with this, but I'm not quite sure about the need for the restriction on this, that there's going to be that many in the Samish neighborhood compared to a lot of our other neighborhoods. You're looking at neighborhoods that are existing already with big lots, big lots, 20,000 square foot lots over in those areas, and saying these things shouldn't go there, but it's fine in all the there's small lot neighborhoods. It's basically removing, those kind of neighborhoods from that. I understand, I love Lake Padden, and that's one of the problems. It does get loved to death because there's so much use around there, but, I don't know if I'm there in terms of pulling that one. I think we've got protections in place that do a pretty good job, so, the Lake Whatcom one, definitely, we know exactly why. That is our main drinking water one. I'm not sure if we're going to do this, that we necessarily need to include that one.
Okay. I'm putting it
I
out there because
understand
it's something I think the city really does need to address at some point. I agree with you, Terry, that this particular ordinance doesn't have a strong nexus to the issue.
Yeah.
But if we don't start addressing the issue in one form or another, and I'm putting this in here as sort of a starting point.
But I think we have started addressing that one because we have very clearly stood up about not wanting to annex property that's coming in that area as protection of those areas. We've done a number of measures, looking at those things. So we have identified that. We've called them out. I just think this one is not the kind of project that's going to make that much difference with that. So, yeah.
And I agree with you. The problem with the annexation part of it was that we did not deny the annexation for environmental reasons. We denied it for financial reasons.
But we talked about it. That was part of our discussion with that.
But we wouldn't, I guess, well, okay. Okay.
I was looking at it.
Dan?
I'd just like to ask what protections are in place for Lake Padden currently?
Well, currently, we've got our critical area ordinance is our main one, and then we also have our stormwater chapter, and I believe there was a discussion topic earlier in the morning about the water quality standards in the Public Works work session that talked a little bit about that. And one of the things I think that I would just like to add is that we're talking about new development versus old development. A lot of the concerns and issues that we've had, and especially some of that Councilmember Weiss has mentioned, that have occurred with the Lake Patton area are due to old development and old development standards. We're talking about new development, so projects coming in under these groups would be subject to our new development standards, new stormwater rules and regulations, new critical area rules and regulations. So at this point, we believe those rules are adequate to do those protections that's necessary for the water quality, the water bodies. Excuse me.
Okay, I dropped that as a proposal then, about the Patton part. Okay, so process-wise for the meeting, are there any other issues associated with what I presented? And then if there isn't, then we'll go into a discussion point by
I'd be
point.
ready to go back to, go
Okay,
issue by
Michael?
issue.
This is a rather small and technical point, and it has to do with what a multifamily zone, what qualifies as a multifamily zone. And I looked up Barclay. Areas 16 and 17 are strange. They are industrial and multifamily. Because they have multifamily, they're hybrid. One of them is actually industrial / commercial / multifamily. Would those areas, because they have multifamily in them, areas 16 and 17, count under this ordinance?
They would be able to utilize that. The Barclay neighborhood was kind of our first attempt at urban village and mixed use zoning. So we took all of our existing zoning designations and threw them all in there to hopefully to encourage that mixed use type of development style. So because residential multi is one of the general use types associated with the zoning, it would be allowed in those areas that are zoned that way.
Okay. All right, so let's just go through David's memo to us and kind of get resolution on these different points. So the first one had to do with historic resource protection. Does the committee have any strong feelings one way or the other as to whether to accept their recommendation that we would include it?
I feel that protecting the historic character of our neighborhoods is critical, and I feel that absolutely this must be included.
And I totally agree. So I would move that we include staff recommendation. That
You could if you were part of the committee.
What? I am.
I'm sorry. You are.
I am. Of course I am. Yes.
Harry, I'm sorry. I was going off of last year when
I
Roxanne
know.
was part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would do.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would move
We have a
the
motion on the
inclusion
floor. I'm sorry, Terry.
Jack?
of- Okay.
Michael.
I'm on the committee, so I won't be voting on this recommendation, but we did receive a letter from the Realtor Association expressing concern on this historic provision. And one of the points they raised is that it seemed like they were worried about this prohibition that would prevent tear-downs, removes some of the development potential from Area 11. When we assessed the development potential of Area 11, did we not include tear-downs as part of assessing what its potential would be? Did we assume that they were going to be torn down and therefore preventing tear-downs reduces the development potential, or did we assume they wouldn't be torn down and so this actually doesn't reduce development potential?
I actually don't know that answer with the land use numbers. Greg, no. We're not sure. We can definitely find that out and come back with you tonight if so need be.
Okay. We have a motion on the floor. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, that recommendation passes through. The second issue is distance to transit. And we have, I guess, three different possibilities, I think, maybe. One is that there would be quarter mile. Another one was possibility of a third mile. And another one was the proposal I put out, which had to do with two different tracks. And it would be a third of a mile for the 50-year and a half a mile for the permanent affordability track. So, see, Terry?
Would it be helpful if we had the discussion first on two tracks, if that's
Well, we're going to have to do it at some point.
right? And yeah, is it
Okay.
Yeah, we have that, you know.
There are two proposals in the two tracks, so I think we would need to adopt the two-track system formally before we can move forward and starting to talk about these individual pieces.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
All
we
right, so
can
we'll take
shift
a quick divergence in our discussion and talk about the track issue. I guess I had a question for you, David. We've had a brief discussion last week about this concept. What's your thoughts about doing something this way in order to try and preserve the permanent affordability concept that that's currently in place, as well as do what you're suggesting?
Well, we've had a few internal conversations, and I think our concern on the staff level is the complexity of having a two-track system. Is that, whatever we can do to make it simpler, and that's what we were trying to do with these amendments, was to incentivize projects to come into one system and not have two different systems. And so there's a little bit of concern with respect to that. The other thing I really didn't catch until I was going back and reading your notes this morning was that the limitations that you proposed on the track for the 50-year affordability of going to the market rate housing, I guess I didn't catch that detail, but in essence, 100% of the units are going to be regulated for income as a result of that. And I think that that causes the likelihood that that track's not going to be achieved, because all of a sudden we're going to be regulating 100% of the units. And so I wouldn't see a private person, private developer wanting to do a track like that. And then also we would have to develop some kind of mechanism that would monitor for 50 years affordability between the 81 and 120% marketability. And so either we pay for that out of general fund for compliance monitoring, or we charge a developer for that. But some way we'd have to ensure that compliance, which would be challenging. So.
Well, just to that point, the way that I wrote this up, which was based on the language that was actually in the that I've read, was the annual income at initial occupancy, but there wasn't a requirement for ongoing monitoring for that part of it.
Yeah, and sorry, when we say initial occupancy, that's at any sale as well. So when we monitor for any homeowners, when they sell the unit, there's a required affordability for that whole period of time. So if you are successful and earn more money, great for you. We don't boot you out of your house, but on a resale, we do monitor for affordability.
One thing I was thinking about over the weekend was just how do we deal with this monitoring issue? And the city puts out service contracts for different things, whether it's garbage service, or whether it's fuel jobbing for our fleet, and we end up having these really long-term contracts. And I'm wondering whether or not we would want to explore a monitoring contract that would be long-term, that would be able to, as developments come on board, that the city could just basically assign over, say, like on a per unit basis, and go through an RFP, and whoever would be the winning bidder would then be able to, to do that monitoring for the city at a per unit cost.
Yeah, and there's several different ways to do that, and I think Dan asked that question at the hearing as well about the monitoring, and so we don't have specific provisions written here, but we have a requirement that whatever process get developed as part of the decision-making process in front of the hearing examiner, so that we would have that mechanism in place and how it's going to pay for and things like that. So I think that's an option of doing that. Right now, our monitoring fee program for home buyers, we charge $1,000 per unit, and we're setting that aside into a monitoring fund for making sure that we can do that. Home buyers is not as challenging because the turnover isn't quite as much. Knock on wood, they're going to be in their home for quite a while, and so you only have to do it at the sale times, and so the cost isn't as much as it is in our rental program.
Okay. See, Dan, and then Michael.
Where's the evidence that going to a 50-year model would incentivize private developers to utilize this ordinance? Are there other communities where this model has been enacted, and are we taking from that evidence, or what is the evidence?
Well, the 50-year affordability is what's under the growth management of having that as a requirement. I think that the evidence is that in 11 years we've had 2 projects in Bellingham and under the permanent affordability, because really that's one organization that does that. So, so the thought is how do we attract other ways to do that to get more people involved? I think alternatively, there's another way to doing that is lowering the number of units. In theory, you could have a project that comes in that's private market led that carves out then 40 or 51%, whatever you end up on that number, of being permanently affordable or 50-year restricted, but the private developer does the project and then sells off those units. That's a model that could work. Right now with 100% affordable, we have no interest of private development led projects.
So is 50 the magic number, 50 years?
50 is under the growth management, and any kind of zoning incentive is that you have to do 50 years as an incentive for affordable housing for low income.
But I guess what I'm asking is are there private developers within the community that have said that we will move forward with projects under the 50-year model?
No, we haven't looked for that at this point.
Okay.
Michael has the floor, but as penance, I'm going to give it to you, Terry.
Yeah, I was thinking on the same lines, I think where you're at with that, because I haven't seen any evidence that changing it from permanent affordability to that 50-year would make any difference. Yes, we haven't had them, but we're also looking at a number of other items here that would incentivize it that I would prefer trying before we go to the 50-year. I would prefer to keep a one track with permanent affordability and then set the rate of what percentage needs to be permanently affordable. Because that way it keeps that into that system.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to derail this process, but we live in a community where 66% of people cannot afford to buy a house in Bellingham. And so I'm definitely all for affordable home ownership. I'm a Culshan CLT homeowner. My wife Kelly Bashaw and I live in the Sunnyland neighborhood, and we're proud CLT homeowners. I see the value in it, but what I would want to do is provide a program that incentivizes more production of affordable housing. So I'm just trying to figure out how that process can work and how that will attract private developers and CHODOs, community housing development organizations like Culshan and others to produce housing in Bellingham.
Well, I think part of the answer is twofold, and Kurt just reminded me too, is that under the housing levy, we don't require permanent affordability either. We require 50 years of affordability for home ownership, and so that's a program that's available under our housing levy as well. But if you do permanent affordability, there's only really one organization in town that this is now available to. And so no matter what you would do, if you do a 50 years as an option, we are expanding the universe of people that provide affordable housing. Could do that. Now, Habitat's partnering with Culshan and doing things, but their normal restriction is not permanent affordability. They allow resales as well and not requiring permanence as part of it. So right now, the only organization that does permanent affordability is one organization in Bellingham. So we are expanding our pool and our options by not having that as a requirement in this ordinance, without a doubt. Whether or not we're successful, time would tell.
Michael?
Let me start by saying that I think we're all trying to move towards the same thing, which is that more people taking advantage of this program or housing levy programs. Personally, I think relaxing that to 50-year from permanent may not be a huge incentive. By itself, it won't be enough, but it's an incremental incentive. So I would like the committee to be open-minded about changing to 50-year, or at least one track that's 50-year. But my question has to do, and I've lost track of where I was going with this. Hold on, please. Oh, it has to do with what you were talking about earlier about the compliance issue, the tracking for the permanent affordability. I've talked about a similar idea having to do with our housing levy program, and maybe with this program as well, providing that support for the private sector. They're really gun shy of red tape. If we could provide support, hand-holding, either in-house hand-holding, where we help them with their compliance and tracking, or, as Jack's suggesting, a contracted service where that contracted service takes over that monitoring compliance so the private developer can walk away responsibly from that. I think I talked to Director Sepler about this and Mr. Evans from the Building Industry Association. You know, is there a way that we could use internal resources or contracted resources for that compliance tail end? And that might be a far more important incentive for private developers, that they're willing to come in and build a project, but they're not willing to assume a 50-year tail. If we could remove the 50-year tail from them, give them a responsible place to put that tail, I think that would be maybe one of the largest incentives to maybe bringing in some private sector developers. So I don't know if that can or should be built into this particular thing, but I think more in general for the housing levy programs in this program, we should look towards that kind of a mechanism if we want to incentivize private developers, not just the CHODOs, the nonprofits.
I would concur with that, Michael. I think that is one of the, I think, main barriers to having affordable housing in the community, at least from the private development sector. But I don't know, what do you want to do about that, committee?
I prefer not.
Or about.
I would prefer to work on what we've got here first before we discuss
I'm wanting
to
to bring back to
because before I would vote on that, I would want staff to do some more input in looking at that because.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, so we could have a direction requesting that we would want to get more information associated with that idea. Actually, what I was wanting to do was to bring it back to the discussion about tracks.
Right, that's
and
that's where I want to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you have a preference?
I would support staff information on Michael's idea, but I would, in terms of the tracking piece, I do want to incentivize private development, and so if the 50-year piece serves that, then I would support that. And I would also support the permanent affordable track as well. So the two-track system that was being proposed on page 62 of the packet here today by Councilman Weiss. So I would support the two-track system.
So is that a motion?
Yeah, move to adopt Councilman Weiss's proposal, page 62, as it stands here.
Jack,
Yes, Kelly.
it sounds like Terry was asking for more information, and this was not necessarily a vote, but give direction. And it might be, if you'd like the council to come back, or the staff to come back and give you information, so that you know what the impacts, the costs, or whatever. I have no idea what the impacts would be. The staff would be happy to do that, but I didn't know that I thought we were giving direction today.
There's two different concepts on the table right now, and I guess I want to try and separate them out. Michael came up with this idea about a better monitoring mechanism.
Right.
And Dan said that he supported it. Terry.
And I just didn't want it clouding what we're trying to do right now on the track because it
So
didn't
actually,
fit with
what
we're
I'd like to
discussing.
do, for process-wise, is to deal with the track issue first, and then let's go back to the monitoring issue right after that, and provide a motion for requesting direction.
Right, withdraw the motion.
Yeah, and I guess what I was asking is, would you like more information about the tracking? I mean, the impacts of doing one or two different tracks, would that be at all helpful to the council?
Yeah, of course. Roxanne?
One hope and dream that I have that is so simple is that we'll actually talk to the builders and the developers so they can tell us information, so we're not the non-business, business group that's trying to make a decision about this.
Well, let me say that there is a list of recommendations, because Seth and I spent 6 months talking to the builders about what would incentivize them to do affordable housing. And to tell you the truth, I don't know if that's included in this. This is a separate kind of a one-off of the big picture. And we did present that at one time, but I'm happy to present it again so that you understand there is some organized information that the not-for-profit builders, Habitat for Humanity, Goshen Land Trust, Opportunity Council, and private builders and bankers were all involved in this group. So I think it might be helpful if we could bring that back to you so that you could move forward faster rather than slower with at least an initial set of information about things that had been recommended.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably a pretty good idea, Kelly. I guess what we could do as a committee is to do two different things. One is to do what Kelly was suggesting, which is that we just ask the staff to come back with more information about how a two-tracked system would work.
Okay.
And then second is that we go through the rest of the memo and the rest of the issues to see what things we can agree with right now, at least get those off the table, and then just really deal with, should we do the original proposal, a 50-year, or to come up with a two-track proposal?
I just want to clarify in that motion that I withdrew. What I don't want to do is I don't want to retreat from the permanent affordability plan. I want to look at both. I want to look at the 50-year and the permanent, and that was my reasoning for that. And I would move to support the mayor's recommendation.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing, because at this point, I was trying not to support a two-track if we can. I would like to see a simplified, and so I would like to get more information. Maybe that will, maybe additional information will swing me to support a two-track. But I don't, but I'd like to see that in the cost and what the complications.
Sure, and I concur, and that was my intent.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have we have a motion on the floor that would request direction from staff, or to provide direction to staff to come back with to the planning committee with more information associated with a permanent affordability track and a 50-year track, how that would work together, and any other unintended consequences with that. I would like to say, just as a discussion point, is that on that table, what I tried to do in that proposal of having a two-track system was really to keep it as simple as possible. And I understand that you don't want to make it as complex, because the complexity could really go off the map. But I really tried to limit it to just a few different little items where there'd be differences that would provide benefits to a developer that was going to provide permanent affordability, while at the same time not detract from the private sector developments of 50-year affordability. So, any other discussion? All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. That passes unanimously. All right, so let's get to, just briefly, to Michael's thought about monitoring. And does anybody want to put together a motion on that, just so we can move forward with that?
Michael, can you just restate the beginning of what you had said?
The committee might want to request that staff look into ways that we can provide support for monitoring compliance for affordability in a way that would help relieve for-profit developers from a responsibility that might be a disincentive to their participation.
Somebody would make that as a motion?
I've got a question with that about, we want to relieve for-profit builders. If you're going to do it, is that something you want just for-profit builders, or is that a burden that, you're singling out one and we're looking at two groups, you're trying to open it up for one, but does that provide
you want to?
restrictions on another? I don't know, because
I think
this
it's
is
a great
so totally
question.
new to me, so I don't know what that means.
Include that in the discussion when it comes back. It's a really good point, Terry.
So, okay, so you want to just remove the words for-profit and just have developers?
Sure, it's not my
Okay.
motion. It's-
I know, it's your suggested motion that I'm looking for somebody to make. Dan?
So I'm moving that we provide staff direction in providing information and monitoring compliance for developers for this program.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Well, it's information now.
It's information. Okay. Okay, so we've dealt with the track issue. Now we're back to the transit issue. I guess we really can't do much. Well, maybe just a brief discussion about distance. And the staff is suggesting a WTA recommendation of a quarter mile. They said that up to third is okay, or what did it say? It seems reasonable, is I think what he said. But other than that, there's other issues associated with it. Let's start with Dan and then Terry.
Okay, so this goes back again to the lack of affordable home ownership opportunities in Bellingham. 66% of people cannot afford to own a home in this community. So I think that putting barriers in front of the possibility of home ownership is not the direction that we should go. I would call for either no limitations on transit or a half mile. I would consider a half mile, but 1/4 of a mile and 1/3 is just, it's too small of a distance. And I do want to say that I've worked with many folks from the community who have people who have disabilities, and I understand the mobility issues and the challenges in getting to transit. I do fully understand that. My wife Kelly is a daily bus rider. So I do understand the mobility issues. However, putting up barriers like redlining, forcing Chodos to look for housing opportunities in 60% rental concentrated neighborhoods, or adding transit barriers is not the direction that we should be moving in. I would move no limitation.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor, Terry.
Yeah, and my comment regarding that is I'm assuming the reason of the distance has to do with one of the incentives of allowing this is reduced parking, meaning, is that correct? With these, as part of it, the director, from what I read, you can have reduced parking on these developments. Is that or did I misread that?
No, that's something that all developers could ask for, is a reduction in certain development standards, and parking is one of those.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that, that we have heard regarding this, though I completely understand and agree with many of the things that Councilmember Hamel noted about not trying to, or trying to support affordable housing in any opportunity that we can. We've got an industry standard that says people simply won't use transit if it's too far to go. Now, some people still will, but the numbers, overwhelming numbers, as David mentioned earlier, they just won't do it. I think David has alluded in the past to when people have the challenges associated with the amount of money that they're making and how much that's going towards their home ownership or for their rents. They tend not to have vehicles as well. So we don't want to put these places too far away to where they actually don't have the opportunity, or it's making it even harder for them to get to their jobs and to the places in order to earn that amount of money for them. So.
And that was your chart, David, I think you had about.
Terry.
Yeah. My only concern about loosening the distance from the quarter mile would be if we increase the distance from transit, then we put in a clause that says we do not allow reduced parking for those situations, because as you get away from it, you do need cars to get there, because most people aren't going to use it. That bears out statistically. I don't want to put make it so strict that shouldn't be able to do that, but you shouldn't go for reduced parking because, poor people are going to use transit more often when you're not near a bus line. That those two are kind of incompatible. So if we increase the distance allowed from a bus line, then we should also remove any incentives about reduced parking for those, because you're going to need the parking. See what I mean? And then you're going to, affect the neighborhoods with that. You can't use that argument, well, people are just use the bus lines.
So this discussion's kind of an interesting one because it's taking one complex issue and maybe addressing it with another complex issue. And if we did not have a transit provision in there at all, but then under the parking reduction component of it, that we had a parenthetical clause in there that said that, any project that was built within a quarter mile or a third mile, or pick the distance, that would be that you would not be eligible for parking standard or no, anything over that you wouldn't be available for a parking standard reduction. It's only within the area that's close to a bus line. How does that fare?
Well, I think that's one option. Again, I'm looking at incomes and, two-person family, $27,000. That's the income level that we potentially add at 50% of area median income. And so the idea of needing access to transit, as well as we're providing 50% density bonuses and having that so far off of a transit route, you have to start correlating that we're doing increased density bonuses along with targeting affordable home ownership at income levels that really have a reliance on potentially transit routes. So, there is a correlation between all this stuff that part of it is getting at, I think, with a parking standard, right. I think, because in essence, you're not reducing it, but then if you are a family at 50% of area median income, do you have enough cars to support your household in the first place? And do we want to have that density with cars going down the roads because they can't get access to transit? Right. A half-mile standard probably takes you at least 20 minutes to walk to get to the route.
10 minutes. I live a half mile from a GO line.
You're in good shape.
It takes 10 minutes for me.
That's
Might be different in 10 years, but right now.
It is.
So, those things do correlate there, and I think that the sensitivity of this, and again, we're looking at the comprehensive plan, talks about incentives, a quarter mile of transit. These things are written into policy documents that we have with the city. It's written into the policy documents we have for funding of any of our affordable housing programs in the city. We adopted that as a quarter mile standard that was recommended by the council. So, so all those things are all woven into this conversation. So discarding it, I think I'm just going to urge some real caution on that.
Can I add something to that?
Sure, Kelly.
Because this is looking at housing and building housing, affordable housing, but we also remember that we're going through the comprehensive plan and we're deciding where that housing is going to be. And so it's not just the housing in isolation, it's the housing as part of our comprehensive plan. And you're going to be making some really tough decisions on whether or not we expand UGAs or retract them, and what we annex, and what the city's going to look like after, based on the direction this next comprehensive plan is giving us. So we want to think about, I think David raised the issue, more density, more isolated. And is that, when we're thinking of our whole comprehensive plan, is that one of the goals we have? And so I just think that it can't just be based on what's happening now. It has to be based on what we want our community to look like. And as far as I can tell, the closeness to transit and walkability is something this council has talked about over and over and over and over. And we're just trying to be consistent with that, Dan. I understand what you're saying because we want housing affordability. And I obviously support Kulshan and other people that are doing that. But I'd like you to think about it really hard, too, before we take that transit goal out.
Yeah, the real issue is just, I guess, the availability of land supply, you know, next to transit lines that are built there because there's a lot of people there already. And so that means that there isn't going to be a great availability of vacant land, unless we're talking about redevelopment. That's another matter, at least in non-historic district areas. But Terry,
Yeah, you know, I had my druthers. The land supply would be there, and everything would work. You know, that quarter mile is the ideal. But I kind of understand what Dan's saying is right now. If you look at where a lot of poor people end up, people are willing to go to Paradise, to Maple Falls, and other kind of stuff, places we don't, you know, I mean, there is nothing in terms of employment, but they go there because that's where the cheap housing is. If we limit everything to just, you know, a specific corridor, we do limit some opportunities. And if people are willing to go to Paradise or Maple Falls because that's where they can afford a house, knowing there's no transit. Well, there's a bus that goes once a day, but it's not going to help you with the job. At least within the city, you know, our limits, it's in a reasonable distance to get to places. So it might sound okay. You know, you threw a new curve on me on this one as I was looking at expanding it, but
okay,
I
Roxanne.
can support it.
Roxanne.
Boy, this really feels like a chicken and an egg, because we need the private industry to create these development projects. But I have a lot of optimism about the future of this, because let's say we go with the half mile. The mayor and 2 council members serve on the WTA board. So if we got the right size development and we started creating larger development, the WTA board could improve those routes. So it might be less than a quarter mile if we create the proper size in the future. I know that's hinging on a lot of things, but my bigger goal is right there with you, Dan. We need to get these projects going and figure out the ways that it will be less restrictive to try to get those projects up in the air.
Okay, last comment on this, Michael.
Thanks, Jack. I think this is a quintessentially city council kind of discussion, because it really is the policy choice of where we want to move the slider on this issue. Our transportation, the wisdom is the way to solve transportation problems is not by making it easier to get from point A to point B, but to actually bring point A and B closer to each other. That's what we're trying to do here, is create proximity. The quarter mile standard, as the staff points out, it's kind of built into many of our other planning documents. It's built into our comp plan right now in a number of ways. I think it's built into the traffic impact fee reduction program. A quarter mile is a number we shouldn't abandon quickly. On the other hand, I have some sympathy for relaxing the standard. Colson's projects over in Indiana Street, I did a little mapping on there. And going one way, it's a little less than a half mile to a bus route, and going another way, it's a little more than a half mile, at least to the 2 bus routes that I knew of in the area. So half mile might have worked for that program, but quarter mile, I think I've been told, wouldn't have worked for that program. So I got some sympathy. I don't have any sympathy for removing the transit standard altogether. So whether it's a quarter, a third, a half, I don't know. It seems like it's wise. And I have it in my notes here, Roxanne, what you said. The real solution is an expanded transit system so that more places are within a quarter mile of transit or a half mile. And this is neither a barrier to this program or a barrier to anybody in any home being able to use transit. So those are my comments about this one provision.
Okay, we need to do a reality check here. We need to deal with this particular motion, and then we need to stop the conversation on this agenda item, because we have one more to deal with, and we have some other things to do before 12 o'clock when our next meeting starts. So the other part of this whole thing, too, is that it's not just unlimited transit. Well, if we did put any sort of requirement on it, that, to me, it seems like the frequency is a big issue too. You know, you don't want to, I think, because for instance, you know, there's a bus route on Bakerview right now that does, you know, it goes twice in the morning, twice in the afternoon, and that's it. And technically, under these provisions that are presented to us right now, that would qualify, but that doesn't provide, I mean, that's as good as no transit in a lot of ways, unless you've got those particular working hours or travel hours. So, Dan, I guess I'm not going to support your motion, and the reason is that I think there's something in between that I think would work better. I think that absolutely no limit has some unintended consequences that I am concerned about, and I think we can craft something in between that would work better. So I don't know. That's, I guess, where I'm going to go personally.
And I actually think I am going to support it. Is, you know, I just keep looking back when I was starting out in trying to housing and stuff. If I could have found a place that I could afford, especially when I was younger, and it was a little farther to get to the transit or whatever, or a car, you know, get a car, I would have made anything to make that work. You know, I would have made it work. I would have walked, no problem walking farther, or no problem riding the bike farther to get to the transit, or trying to keep my $100 car going, or whatever it is, because to get the opportunity for home ownership, people are willing to make it work. And if we annex some property, you know, it's probably going to be outside that distance, and does that mean that would be ineligible for these kind of projects, which actually might be the biggest incentive for people to do it, you know, as we grow in some of those areas, but there might be more open spaces to do that. So I'll support it.
Okay, so Kelly, we really are crunched on time.
I know you are, and I just want to say, as part of this, would you like us to look also into a little bit more? It's not just transit service when you're building out there. It's police, fire, roads. I mean, there's a lot of other things. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix. But we'll look at the transit, understanding that that's not the only thing that's going to make a difference in where we site housing developments.
I'm sorry, David.
He's sorry, too.
Yeah, I know.
You
You were hoping to be done with this whole thing today.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sticking in there with us. And also, one real final comment to Michael's thing about the Indiana Street project. You know, 2 years or 3 years ago, that was within 100 feet of a transit line, but it got under service cutbacks. It got zapped. So things change, and it'll be changed a lot next year under the strategic plan that WTA is doing. Okay, so all those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye or no? Okay, so that's a mixed recommendation, and we'll just put that in there as part of the overall mix. And we will meet at staff's convenience at another planning committee on this agenda item whenever they have some additional information for us. Thank you, David. Thank you, Kurt. We have a second agenda item, which is not going to be quite as long.
Did we take a vote at all or anything on the limits on location about the water?
We can't do that right now. We'll have to do that at another meeting. We
Okay.
really are tapped for
Okay.
time. Okay, so our second item is a review of the docket process for the 2015-2016 Comprehensive Plan Amendment Update.
Members of the committee, we come before you.
And this is Rick Sepler, Planning Director.
Planning and Community Development Director. We come before you to talk about status of the ongoing docket process. As the committee is aware, we have in our municipal code, consistent with state law, the ability to amend our zoning or comprehensive plan on an annualized basis. You assemble all the applications, that you accept them, and you bring them forward for consideration on a schedule. Many communities have a schedule actually into their code where specific months are there. We're not as specific. But when we review those, the very first criterion that's used is to make sure that staff has capability to review the application that comes forward. That's acknowledging that there are many things that are moving forward. You want to make sure you have the resource to do the work. As the committee is aware, we are initiating or in the midst of our comprehensive plan update, and that update has significant importance to the community. Moreover, it requires all of our available resources. Nonetheless, we have received a number of applications for the docket, and what we would propose for your consideration is that rather than reject them all because of lack of resources, we just extend the timeline so that we could slide them till after the first of the year when we have our draft plan prepared and starting review with this body. That would free up the resources we need to be able to consider them timely and not ask those applications we receive to wait for another full year cycle to go by. In addition, any changes in the comprehensive plan could be perfected before they're considered, at least in policy level.
Do you see that any of the ones that you've received so far, or are you anticipating receiving, would be severely impacted by having a delay like this?
In terms of their schedule, there are several that have come in. I could ask Greg could give you more specifics that are business-related decisions. We know of one that is in a 2-year cycle where they're going to be asking for funds. It's a not-for-profit to expand and need a modification. That specifically was why we were looking to just, rather than wholesale say we don't have capacity, just delay the process, save them some time. I think in both cases it's reasonable in the delay and wouldn't have an adverse effect. Greg, do you want to?
And nothing's coming forward from any neighborhood that you're aware of?
So far, no.
Okay. Any thoughts about this, committee? Okay. So I guess we're providing direction, and
That's correct.
Our direction is to support your endeavor and to do what you need to do in order to make the delay happen. Do we need any formal action for doing this?
Nope, just a head nod, I think, from the committee was what we were looking
It
for.
does make it easier than voting no on these.
Yes.
Support staff. So.
And what we'll do is we'll contact the applicants, describe the circumstance, say that this is the best way to continue to advance their interests, but there'll be a little bit of a delay as compared to in prior years, but still would be within the same cycle.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. No other business. We are adjourned for the